What I want to talk about this Shabbat, something that happened this past week that I imagine most of you have seen already. Oscars, I don't know if you've seen the film or not. There's a film called The Zone of Interest, which actually looks to me, from what I've seen and read about it, like a very nice film, one that I very much wanted to see. Until it won the award for the Best International Film, and its director, Jonathan Glazer, stood up there in his acceptance speech and said some of the most personally offensive things I've ever heard a fellow Jew say publicly. A message that I really, when I heard about it, was deeply disturbed, as I know so many of my fellow congregants and Jews around the world felt. A sense of betrayal, a sense of anger and disgust, rage, pain, shock that someone could stand up there and use an opportunity like that in that way. It's a difficult speech to listen to. And we've seen in the week since, despite him speaking in the plural, we stand here as men who refute. That some of those who stood with him have changed, or at least have made statements that they didn't know what he was going to say and weren't a part of it, and they don't agree. But I want to look at what it was that he said and why it was so offensive. Because the words he said themselves, perhaps in a different context, are words we may have been able to listen to. But given the venue, given the place where he was, I don't think he could have said anything worse than what it was he said. In a time when anti-Semitism is rising more than we've ever seen it since the Holocaust, since the Shoah, when acts of not just anger and violent words are used against us, but physical violence and damage is happening to Jews and to Jewish institutions around the world at a pace that's unprecedented in recent history. His words only added to the fire, to the flames. He hijacked, and this is why I think it was so painful for so many of us, what could have been an incredible moment to stand in front of the world and stand for a message of what the lessons of the Shoah are, how easy it is for our society to accept Jew hatred as just normal course, how easy it is for our society to thrive while listening to the screams of anguish and pain, while witnessing what happens to our Jewish neighbors right next door, which is what the film's about. One of the most complicated mitzvot I think there are in the Torah, there's often debate about it. So the laws of kashrus, laws of Shabbos, so the intricacies of the holidays. One of the most complex areas of Jewish law, I think, is the area of Tochacha. Not that the laws themselves are so complicated, but because of the context that surrounds it. Tochacha, rebuke. It's a commandment in the Torah. When you see your fellow doing something wrong, you're supposed to stand up and say to them that they're doing something wrong, which makes sense. If you care about someone, you shouldn't sit by while you watch them going down the wrong path, making mistakes, whether it's in their personal, professional life, in their ethics, their morals. If you care about someone, you stand up and you tell them that. That's part of having a relationship with somebody. But anyone who's ever tried to tell a close friend or a family member they're doing something wrong knows that it's harder than that. Oftentimes, they don't want to hear us. Oftentimes, it can damage that relationship. Oftentimes, if it's a person like me, perhaps, when I was a kid, and the easiest way to get me to do something was to tell me not to do it. Tochacha is much more complex. And in the later law books and codes, the rabbis tell us that one of the most important things about Tochacha, rebuke, is that you have to know when you give it, the other person is going to be able to hear it. And that while you're commanded to rebuke someone for doing the wrong thing, you're also forbidden to rebuke them in a way that might make them double down or lean into it. To do it publicly and embarrass them, to do it at a time or in a place where they're not going to be able to hear you, or instead your words may anger them and cause them to go even more to the wrong path, the action that they're taking. And that, I think, is really the issue with what Jonathan Glazer set up there. In a different time, in a different place, in a different context, his words are tochacha, words of rebuke. Words that I think there is a commandment to say in a time and in a place. There certainly are those who want to hijack the Holocaust and Judaism for a nationalist and right-wing and violent agenda. We hear those voices. But at a time when the world is denouncing our right to self-determination, to self-defense, when on our university campuses there are intellectuals and news networks are refusing to call terrorism terrorism, or talking about violence and murder and rape as somehow moral forms of resistance, as opposed to what they are, despicable acts of inhumanity, of immorality. It's not the context. I had a teacher in rabbinical school who warned us to be very, very careful. He told us that there would be times in our life Israel would do things that we would disagree with. We would want to offer criticism. There are times we'd want to participate in this act of tochacha, rebuke. And then not only should we're morally and commanded and obligated to the duty of patriotism to criticize your country when your country acts wrong. But he warned us very much about the time and the place. To be careful that our words won't be taken out of context, that our words wouldn't be used to fuel anti-Semitism or hatred or anti-Zionism, which we know is all too often, if not more and more, I'm thinking always, when it's offered beyond the Jewish community, just veiled anti-Semitism. There's a time and a place for tochacha. In a different context, there's an interesting conversation that could have been had around what Jonathan Glazer had to say. But he missed an opportunity, because that was a time and a place given his audience for tochacha, of what we're seeing too often today. Of people picking one side that they see as the David versus the Goliath, without looking at context. Of people trying to have a 30-second opinion or understanding and offering an opinion on what's a very complex geopolitical situation. It's awful, the number of deaths of civilians that occurred in Gaza. But it's not the responsibility of Israel. Israel had a ceasefire on October 5th, on October 6th. It was October 7th when Israel needed to defend itself. It was October 8th when the world immediately, even before there was a response, even before there were civilian deaths in Gaza, the world immediately began to blame what happened on October 7th on Israel. And bit by bit, we've heard more and more from those that stood by us criticism. More and more from those who stood by us, they think they have the right to tell Israel what to do, to demand it. It's not tochacha. Tochacha isn't power, it's not coercive. Tochacha is using your words to offer an opinion. say this is what I think is right, and to use our words to have a real conversation, one that needs to happen. But it can only happen when the world's willing to recognize that Jews have a right to live with self-determination in our ancestral homeland, that we have a right not to be slaughtered, that we have a right not to be brutally victimized and violated because we're Jewish. And sadly, it's a lesson we hoped would have been learned from the Shoah. And it's a lesson Jonathan Glazer missed in his movie about the Holocaust from sharing with an audience that more than anyone needs to hear it. There has to be a place for in-depth conversations and discussions about what it means to have a Jewish military, what it means to have a Jewish country that can defend itself. Those conversations can't happen until the world recognizes first that we have a right to exist. Shabbat Shalom.